of the talk we're giving in Ontario. Tomorrow we're just this evening off after this talk to Underway, and going all the way to Prairie, BC later next week. So just to introduce myself, my name is Jérôme. I work on staff at Cégep Maisonneuve. CEGEPs, just for the record, because I'm going to be talking about those in Quebec, which aren't exactly something that exists outside the province. These are collèges d'enseignement général professionnel. So these are mandatory 2-year colleges between high school and university. And I'm going to be talking, of course, about those institutions, which are, of course, have a certain importance in the student movement. I'm also a member of, I was a member of BFAC back when it was active in Quebec, Northeastern Federation of Anarcho-Communists, and I'm also a member since 2008 of UCL, Union Communiste Libertaire, which is, as was said, a anarchist communist political organization which is present in 3 cities in the Quebec province. In 2012, I was involved through my student union at the University of Montreal, where I took part-time classes because my working contract is full-time at the Cégep Maisonneuve. So through my student union, I was involved in helping out organizing not only any elected office, but I was involved in the student movement since 2004. First as on the executive board of my student union, my Cégep student union, and afterwards, just on the eve of the 2005 student strike in Quebec, which I'm going to touch on a bit later, I was a member of the coordination committee of ASSE, which is another organization I'll be talking about, and also a member of the negotiations committee, which was active for a short while during that student struggle. So I wanted to start my talk just by saying that the student movement in Quebec has recently written an important chapter in its history. The strike that was launched back in February against the latest strike in the university tuition fees turned out into one of the largest social movements in Quebec's history, and perhaps even Canada's entire history. Of course, one of the interesting things about that struggle is that news of the student strike has went across the borders of the province, and of course many in English Canada have taken notice. So we're not only happy that our struggle has inspired hope among the left and among students about our ability to fight back in this climate of austerity and where business and state leaders seem to reign unchallenged, but we're especially excited to see that the fact that the strike has sparked debates right here in Ontario and other provinces about charting a way forward for the student movement and social movements in general. Our hope is that this conference tour and this talk we're giving this afternoon can bring perhaps some meaningful insights into this discussion. So the talk I've prepared this afternoon is divided in about 3 parts. The first part, I will talk about the history of the Quebec student movement. I will then speak about the ideas and practices of combative unionism, and then I'll finish with some practical ideas and illustrations about how this history and how these ideas about practicing a certain kind of unionism translated into the 2012 student strike. As it's been said, the talk will last for about an hour, perhaps even more. I'll try and keep it short, but and I do hope that everyone's going to stick around after my speaking, so we can have Q&A and of course discussion, perhaps even discussions around concrete projects that we can maybe put together with Ontario folks. So the strike in Quebec didn't happen because we just do things differently, or because there's anything inherently combative about Francophone culture. If we want to help activists and students outside Quebec learn from our movement, I think we need to start by addressing the fog of Quebec exceptionalism. One way we decided to try and tackle that is to talk about history. It's an interesting starting point, I think, because right there's something Quebec, Ontario, and other provinces and countries have in common. We're all surrounded by histories of kings, queens, statesmanship, the elite histories, basically. Quebec isn't any different in that respect. History of popular movements and popular resistance is always overlooked, unless, of course, it plays into the nationalist narrative of the dominant political discourse. What the Quebecois student movement does have, however, is a legacy, a strong tradition of sharing the history of the Quebec student movement. When I started getting involved in my cégep in Saint Laurent, Montreal, I remember we had just an entire room just with archives filled with photographs, newspaper clippings, reports, meeting notes, and such and so forth. It's hard to not spend a bit of time in that kind of place and not feel like a great attachment to all that was accomplished by activists, radical activists who came before us. Of course, that room was a complete mess and it was really impossible to find anything specific. But anyways, the birth of the student movement can actually be traced back in the 1940s, not in Quebec, but actually in France. At the outset of World War II, a number of students, some with links to the anti-fascist resistance, seek to give new direction to existing student organizations. And the apolitical and corporatist attitudes prevalent among student organizations at the time gave rise to ambiguous and strange relationships between student leaders and the Nazi occupiers. So some students started organizing to help transform the student associations into real student unions modeled after labor unions. So in 1946, the Union nationale des étudiants français, which translates into National Union of French Students, UNEF by its French acronym, adopts the founding document, the Charte du syndicaliste de combat, which I'm sure you can read all about on this great screen over there. I'll tell you a bit about it. It's important, I think, because it brings forth new ideas about what the role of students is in society. It defines the student as a young intellectual worker with specific rights and responsibilities which ensue from this particular status. For example, Article 4. As a worker, the student has a right to work and rest in the best of conditions and in material independence, both personal and social, guaranteed by the free exercise of syndicalist rights. Article 4. As an intellectual, the student has a responsibility to seek out, propagate, and defend truth, which entails sharing and advancing culture, as well as drawing the meaning of history. To defend liberty against all oppression, which constitutes for the intellectual his most sacred mission. In its beginnings, French student syndicalism takes off around concrete issues of decolonization and the Cold War. Those who uphold apolitical student associations are confronted directly. Back in Quebec, the notion of student syndicalism doesn't take off around until the 1960s. At that time, student associations in the province are still apolitical and centered mostly around organizing parties and providing services. Perhaps you've heard about these kinds of student unions. But in 1961, students in Université de Montréal organized and write their own charter of student rights and responsibilities, inspired directly by the Charte de Grenoble, or which is later known as the Charte de Grenoble. It's a new ideological paradigm. Students, as young intellectual workers, develop a new sense of awareness of their role in society. They're no longer to content themselves with simply student issues. They start getting involved in worker struggles and identifying with the working class. As a result, more and more student activists subscribe to the idea of building student unions that can not only provide basic services to fellow students, but also unions that can organize struggles and taken thus an active role in shaping society. At the time, society in Quebec is going through rapid secularization, and the education system, which is previously in the hands of religious authorities, is gradually taken over by the state. However, the old authoritarian reflexes of faculty and administrators weigh down on the students' new sense of responsibility. They want to participate in important decisions that affect their institutions. The watchword becomes student power. Another important factor here is that there's only one Francophone university in Montreal, the Université de Montréal. It's elitist, it's expensive, and perched up high up on Mount Royal on Montreal Island, it's pretty far removed from French-speaking working-class boroughs. So there's a feeling here of injustice that gradually grows stronger. So around this fight to democratize access to higher education, students coalesced around new militant student unions, which helped drive the development of this syndicalist tendency. Combined with the general uproar in labor, feminist, and nationalist struggles in broader society, the student movement quickly becomes a force to be reckoned with. In 1964, conscious of the need to coordinate the struggle, conscious of the need to build the financial and organizational tools to maintain a permanent balance of power vis-a-vis the state, syndicalist students and student unions decide to band together and create the Union Générale des Étudiants du Québec, General Union of Quebec Students, which is a Quebec-wide student organization. And just a few years later, in '68, of course, as major student protests inflame Europe, the upheaval crosses the Atlantic and reaches Quebec. A huge wave of turmoil sweeps across the province, and the fledgling student movement in Quebec steps in with the first unlimited general strike of its history. Even though in the aftermath of the strike, the government creates a new public francophone university in Montreal, UQAM, as well as a new network of universities in Quebec, which establishes gradually universities in regions outside the large urban centers, as well as establishing a new student financial aid program, the strike action is perceived as a big failure. It's perceived as a failure simply because the results didn't come close to the huge expectations. Even though the revolt spread across countries and continents, and even started to look like a revolution in a few places, the social outburst eventually died down. That sentiment, shared widely among student militants at the time, was about to have pretty important consequences. In the following years, many local student unions were disbanded, and UGEC, whose memberships was based on these student unions, was also disbanded. It's not that students were massively abandoning the struggle or leaving, abandoning the idea of political struggle. It's because they saw student unions as simply too bureaucratic. They felt student unions held back the students' militancy and the potential for radicalization. So in disbanding and reorganizing in smaller, more radical political groups, they hope to build a truly revolutionary movement. Even though these critics weren't entirely baseless, the decision to kill off student unions was made rashly and without much hindsight. Unsurprisingly, the loss of the only structures and resources that can mobilize a mass movement led to a collapse of the entire student movement. As an added consequence, whole areas of student life on campus, which were previously built and under the control of student unions, fell into the hands of the administrations. Obviously, not everyone was very happy about that state of affairs, and so all of these events sparked a big debate inside the student movement about which forms of organizations were needed. In 1974, the government announces announces plans to introduce university entry tests for Francophone students. So in response, a coordination of syndicalist student unions start organizing for a new general student strike. But the Liberal government wants to prevent any recurrence of the events of 1968, especially on an issue itself it doesn't consider very important. Difficult negotiations with the public sector unions make the prospect of confronting student unions again somewhat less appealing. So he quietly retires its plan to introduce the tests before the students themselves get very far ahead in preparing for general strike. Since the government's reversal on that issue is announced as temporary, students decide nonetheless to press on. The feeling of empowerment from an easy victory inspires them to expand on their platform of demands and to include demands about improving student financial aid. The strike gets going with just a few student unions, but quickly, it gets very much larger. In total, about 40 institutions, CEGEPs, and universities participate in the strike. 4 weeks into the struggle, the government announces a series of concessions, and the strike comes to a close. The success of that second student strike led the next year, in 1975, to the creation of the Association Nationale des Étudiants du Québec, National Association of Quebec Students. As you can imagine, the debate between syndicalist students and affinity groups is somewhat more or less put to rest for the next 20 years. Instead, a more serious challenge emerges from the student right, but I'll get to that just a bit later. By the time of the next large student mobilization in 1978, ANEC eventually grows not just into the main student union, but the student union, which represents quite literally the entire student movement. Most importantly, however, it remains true to its origins by staying committed and by actively promoting and developing rank and file control of student unions and combative militancy. But it's not all fun games, however, with the Parti Québécois being elected in 1976. Why is that? Well, in 1976, the PQ is a really progressive political party. Most importantly for the student movement, it promises to abolish student debt, enact free tuition, and even implement a pre-salary program. It's no surprise because lots of activists involved in ANEC are and activists that experienced the strikes of 1968 and 1974 are involved in the Parti Québécois. The elections of the PQ to the government creates a huge wave of enthusiasm among the entire left. But can you guess what happens to the political party's progressive platforms once it's in government? Right, it's shelved, obviously. So 2 years later, by 1978, there was a rift inside ANEC. On the one hand, the more radical activists want to start organizing for a general strike and to try and force the PQ to implement its own programs, its own electoral promises. While on the other, you have the radical student activists on the other hand, you have the activists loyal to the party, which defend a much more conciliatory stance and with the government hoping to make progress on the issues by way of negotiations and dialogue. Though both factions are about equal in number in ANEC, the radicals, mostly CEGEP students, eventually win a crucial leadership election. The pro-PQ faction, based mostly around a single university around Quebec City region, eventually regroups inside ANEC in its university caucus. Just a few days later, in 78, single rule CEGEP launches the general strike. Their demands, the PQ's own platform about accessibility to higher education. The strike gradually expands, though not as fast as the previous one. After about 3 weeks, 30 CEGEPs are on strike, and also a handful of university departments. As the mobilization starts dying down, however, UQAM Student Union, which is a large student union at the time, gets it a strike mandates and enters the strike. Again, the government is forced into concessions during that strike. Two distinct announcements on improvements to students financially, the strike ends. As students start going back, however, ANEC decides to press on and launches a campaign of occupations of MP offices. And just in a single day, 6 MP offices will be occupied. So with the positive results from this third general strike, there's a renewed feeling of empowerment which helped consolidate ANEC's radical leadership. It will remain a symbol of radicalism and mass mobilization until its very end. Advocates of conciliation and negotiation will have eventually to form their own separate organizations. In 1981, that happens when the ASSE and FAG are born. As the brainchilds of PQ activists whose party holds power, those two new Quebec-wide student unions are rapidly integrated into the state's apparatus. And amazingly, they're also hostile to any form of mass mobilization. Their rallying cry at the time is, "The strike never again." The 80s opened somewhat a gloomier chapter, though, in the history not just for the student movement, but for the left in general. It's the era of the post-referendum, crisis inside the PQ, the worst economic recession since the Great Depression, the dissolution of many revolutionary groups, and difficult battles between the labor movement and the PQ René government. Internationally, Reagan and Thatcher ushered in the age of neoliberalism. The welfare state's definitely on its way up, and policies of privatization and massive cuts in social spending become the order of the day. In Quebec, the Liberal Party succeeds to the PQ in 1985. Under pressure from their youth wing, however, they maintain their promise to have to keep the tuition fees frozen at their levels of 1968. The regime change, of course, is bad news for the ASSE and FAG, whose bodies are entirely controlled by PQ activists, so both organizations eventually collapse into irrelevance. The next year, in 1986, the education minister declares that the tuition fee freeze can't be maintained, it has to be scrapped, and that there's even twice too many university students in Quebec. So you can imagine that sparks some kind of reaction. A few months later, ANEC, after a campaign of general assemblies, a 5,000 strong demonstration on Parliament Hill, a general strike is launched. The main demands issued by those general assemblies and adopted in the Congress of ANEC, member unions as well as non-member unions, are to force the government to maintain the tuition freeze and to dump also university ancillary fees, and again demand improvements to student financial aid. Just 2 weeks into the strike, in which about 25 student unions participate, the education minister comes out with a promise to maintain the freeze until the next elections and temporarily abandon ancillary fees at the county. He also promises to hold a series of meetings with the student organizations in which the demands about student financial aid would be considered. In turn, ANEC's leadership proposes a truce which gets the endorsement of the majority of student unions. The idea is to wait for the results of these meetings, and if they're not satisfactory, get back on strike. A few vocal student unions disagree, though. The perspective of rebuilding a student strike by that time seems unrealistic. The strategic thing to do would be to strike the iron while it's hot and keep the movement, keep the mobilization going until the government can be forced into making further concessions. By the following year, no surprise, there's no progress on student financial aid. ANEC activists believe the Liberals are holding back announcing those adjustments, so the government can an announcement at the same time as their next attempt to hike the tuition fees as a way of appeasing the inevitable discontent. Even though it's not campaigning for a strike just yet, ANEC students and activists decided to organize various protests to keep up the momentum. Occupation of the Education Minister's MP office, another 200 strong occupation of the ministry's office, which was amazingly spread across 2 building floors, and also a 3-day strike. However, just as the student union's special general meeting comes out in support of launching a call for a new general strike, the Liberals, on the other hand, officially announced that they're going to renounce their promise to maintain the tuition freeze. So unfortunately, the 1998 strike never takes off. For the first time, as many as 14 local unions will go down the strike before it even gets underway. And the movement sort of petters out rapidly without the government making any concessions. Even though at the time ANEC's leadership tries to label the premature end of the strike as a sort of strategic retreat, the defeat hits hard against the union. There's a contrast between the leadership's timid optimism, you can say, and the blunt feeling of defeat among the rank and file. It'll actually be the beginning of the end for ANEC. The Liberal Party goes on to be re-elected, and in 1990 the government officially announces a huge tuition fee hike. Bringing those from $500 a year, the same they've been since 1968, to $1,200 a year. At the same time, it gives also universities the power to increase these fees as they see fit by up to 10%. Once again, the next student unions set off plans for a new general strike. It defines a minimum of 30 strike mandates before officially launching the strike. After weeks and weeks of campaigning, though, only a handful of General Assemblies give their assent to a general strike. Nonetheless, a few student unions decide to start the strike on their own in the hopes that eventually other student unions will jump in. The strike is radical, but it lacks coordination. And mobilization is also somewhat uneven, being centered mostly in Montreal and a single other campus in northern Quebec, in a city called Rimouski, where a university and a cégep are present there with the student body mainly from a working class background. At the same time, the student right gets organized. A group of cégep student unions opposed to the strike formed the FEC and allied themselves with a newly formed university student union called the FEC. As the successors of the Pro-PQ, RAE, and FAEC, the two organizations promote an essentially lobbyist strategy. Their hostility to mass mobilization marks, again, a new break in the student movement's legacy for mass mobilization and syndicalism. During the mobilization, the government hammers out its justification for the hike by saying that better financial aid, which of course means bigger loans and more student debt, will eventually compensate for the effects of the hike on poor students. The strike in 1990 ends in historic failure. 3 years later, pulled down by intense internal strife, ANEC is disbanded. For the next 6 years, FEC and FERC would have free reign over the student movement, allowing them ample time and space to roll a sizable chunk of student unions. The student left will only get reorganized around opposition to the federal Axe-worthy reforms in 1994, where those reforms would see transfers of provinces in education and health, most importantly, be slashed. Common initiatives between a few local student unions, protest organizing, one mobilization committee on a specific, I think it was UQAM campus, and a radical student newspaper, eventually lead to the formation of the Mouvement pour le droit à l'éducation, Movement for the Right to Education, or MPE. In 1996, Pauline Marois, which was recently elected as Prime Minister of Quebec, which is at the time PQ Education Minister, announces a hike in university tuition fees and CEGEP ancillary fees. The MDR spearheads a general strike movement, which leads to some unions affiliated with FEC and FERC to eventually join in. After about 3 weeks of that strike, Magua announces she'll scrap the hike, but with a catch. She'll implement a new failure tax proposed to her by the leadership of the FEC. That failure tax would see college students who fail a certain number of classes have to pay a special tax for each failed class. Otherwise, without paying them, they wouldn't be able to carry on their semesters. So that move is immediately considered as treason by radical activists, and the rank and file who built that strike that was successful in stopping the hike of tuition fees. A lot of people are convinced that the strength of the mobilization could have gotten rid of the hike without that trade-off, and that the failure tax was a move deliberately made by the FEC to abort the strike quickly, so it can gain extra credit in the eyes of the government. Even though this bittersweet victory consolidates the motivations of students to keep on organizing, the MDE has a somewhat difficult time escaping marginality and of gaining a significant membership. The MDE will eventually die off 5 years later in 2000. However, despite its relatively small membership, the MDE kept alive radical ideas and practices. Its whole existence relied on the need to distrust leaders, on rank and file syndicalism, and on direct action. For example, the following year, following the 1996 strike and the FEC sellout agreement with the PQ government, the MDE continues to organize protests and occupations demanding a substantial increase in the minimum wage and 32-hour work week, as well as free and quality health and education systems. As such, the MDE contributed to preserve combative syndicalism and to oppose the FEC lobbyist corporatism. The perspective that the FEC and FERC will again dominate the scene, and that the student movement will gradually distance itself from its heritage as a combative and democratic force, it's just too hard to accept for many activists involved in the 1996 strike and the anti-globalization movement at the turn of the century. So in the hopes of helping student unions and the student movement return to its former glory, in 2001 several historically radical student unions unite under the banner of ASSE, Association pour une solidarité syndicale étudiante, which is roughly translates into Association for Solidarity Among Student Unions. So allow me to just step back and say a few things about what I've told you guys about. I've told you about the birth of the student movement in 1968, the first syndicalist student unions, the battles of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But what I've explained so far about that history really is just skimming the surface. Few historians in Quebec have done serious academic works, research into that rich history, and with much more detail and with the broader social context. But unfortunately, none of these works I can find were translated in English, so unfortunately we won't find anything on the literature table. So we apologize for those who might want to look a bit deeper into all that stuff. The idea that, as I've said in the beginning, is to give a sort of idea for where this strike comes from. I hope it's clear by now that there's a lot more to the 2012 student strike in Quebec than simply spontaneity. I want to highlight also that every student strike has been a major turning point in the development of the student movement. After 68 student unions were destroyed, one in 74 gave rise to ANEC. In 78, we saw a rift inside ANEC between radicals and lobbyists. After the success in 86, the lobbyists lost ground, and the failure of 88 divided ANEC, and the aftermath of the failed strike in 1990 against tuition fees helped lobbyist student federations establish themselves permanently. Quebec's student movement, as it exists today, was essentially shaped by mass, collective, and syndicalist type politics and action. Another point I want to make is that the student movement isn't homogeneous, far from it. The vast general strike that we saw this spring in Quebec gave an impression of a united front among the three main student organizations, ASSE, FEC, and FERC. But in reality, the relationship between these student organizations is a lot more complex and I would say caustic even than images of unitary student protests might have led on. But we're not talking about the parochial conflict here. I mean, it's questions of fundamental disagreements, both on elements of practice and political outlook. Before I get into that, I want to speak a bit more about ASSE's history. ASSE is the Quebec-wide student union that created CLASS, which you probably heard of, by opening up its committees and its congresses to unaffiliated student unions to join temporarily. Getting an understanding of ASSE is key, I think, into better understanding the origins of the student strike in Quebec. So on with 2001. The failure tax inherited from the dealings of FEC during the 1996 strike is taking its toll on college students. A coalition of independent local student unions form around the project to launch a campaign and try and have that tax abolished. Here a few things start working in favor of creating a new Quebec-wide student union. First, it quickly becomes obvious how working outside the formal structures of an organization weigh down on the organizing efforts of student activists. And how are the costs to be shared? How can we pool the different resources which student unions have at the time? And also, who or what can track the progress of those campaigns between the different meetings? Secondly, while the student unions are confident they'll be able to stir up a sizable opposition movement to the tax because it's really quite hated, there is specific concern regarding the FEC. As the group that agreed to the failure tax in the first place, the unions worry it might appropriate the opposition movement as its own and use it to go in front of the government and negotiate another rotten outcome against the wishes of the rank and file, of course. Eventually, those preoccupations are confirmed when FEC, who isn't taking part in the mobilizations at all, negotiates with the government student performance contracts in exchange for dumping the failure tax. Student performance contracts would see students have to sign special contracts after failing some classes, which disallow them from failing any further classes unless otherwise they would be banned from, again, pursuing their studies and being subscribed to their, stay subscribed to their universities or CEGEPs. Outside the student movement, there's the broader political context. In 1980, the death of Maoist groups and the gradual domestication of the labor movement leaves an empty space in politics that's gradually overtaken by business interests and the elite. In the 1990s, the first half of the decade is dominated by the question of sovereignty leading up to the 1995 referendum. But it's really the second half of that decade that sets the tone. The PQ's obsession with a zero deficit results in about $2 billion of cuts in education alone in Quebec province. In 2000, during a Quebec Youth Summit, the government agrees to re-inject some funds partially in education, but under strict conditions of implementing a series of reforms inspired by neoliberal and free market policies. It's baptized long ago after the PQ Minister of Education at the time. On a global level, negotiations by states for a multitude of international trade agreements on capital and services points to a new era in the globalization of capitalism. Reports and investigations into these negotiations reveal how far our states are ready to empower capital against people. At the same time, in the WTO summit in Seattle reveals the extent of the potential for popular resistance. Similar events happen in Washington, Genoa, and then Quebec City with the now famous Summit of the Americas in 2001. So ASSE's first activists are really immersed in that anti-globalization movement. So in the first few months of its existence, ASSE renames its campaign against Plan Legault as a campaign against the steering of an education by market laws. In doing so, it manifests a rejection of narrow and piecemeal understanding of state education policies. Instead, by highlighting the role of market laws, it seeks to tie together these different reforms in universities and CEGEPs, and also tries to link those reforms to the changes and dynamics of international trade agreements and capitalist globalization. Even though it's off to a good start, that campaign eventually runs out of steam. At this point, ASSE isn't a very powerful or large student organization with only a dozen member unions. At a large meeting of local student unions from all affiliations, the ASSE Congress then decides to focus on NAFTA. That campaign rallies students from all across sectors of the student movement. As it does, it forces the student federations, FEC and FERC, to come up with their own campaigns surrounding NAFTA. But they can't bring themselves to get behind a radical anti-NAFTA agenda. So they settle on a corporatist and responsible demand of no to the inclusion of education in NAFTA. At a large meeting of local student unions in Quebec from all different affiliations, only a tiny fraction eventually rally behind the Federation's watchword, while most of them will rally instead behind a clear anti-NAFTA agenda. On October 2002, 10,000 people participated in Montreal March against NAFTA. So in the first years of ASSE's existence, its struggles are about the global dynamics on which the student movement has very little ground. The fight against NAFTA isn't able to spark a movement outside the confines of the student movement. In 2003, while the Iraq anti-war movement is popular from its inception, has a popular character from its inception, it fails students aren't able to underline clear political goals they can work towards in the context of that struggle. And when it tackles the phenomenon of steering education by market laws, it's campaigning against nothing less than the vast neoliberal restructuring of education, whose policies are rapidly becoming facts in the different institutions. Nonetheless, ASSE is still able to build a base of support among students. In the context of opposition to international summits, WTO, NAFTA, G8, G20, the student body responds enthusiastically to calls for mobilization. Through these first experiences, ASSE activists are able to develop an open political vision with a deeper understanding of student issues. A new frame of thinking makes its way in the student movement, which is that the root of our day-to-day problems, including in education, can be found in the international economy, and more specifically, in the relationship that builds between human populations and capital. In 2003, however, the focus quickly goes from international to local with the election of a new liberal government and its plans for state re-engineering. It's a shock for the labor and community movements who are used to the PQ's smooth approach of dialogue and consultation. The Liberals waste no time in implementing anti-social reforms, including in education. ASSE puts out a call for a general strike in 2003 against the hike in CEGEP ancillary fees, But all of that attempt ultimately fails to get more than just a handful of student unions on board. The experience isn't all negative though, and the lessons from organizing in this strike campaign come in handy when in 2004 the government decides to convert $103 million from bursaries into loans in the student financial aid program. ASSE reacts by organizing a wide consultation of student general assemblies, and in order to build a platform of demands. that it then proceeds to send that platform of demands to the government, not as a polite request, but as a clear ultimatum. And so, shocked at the government's failure to respond to that ultimatum, the student unions launched a new general strike. Tours of CEGEPs and universities are organized, as well as massive distribution of material, demonstrations, and even occupations of empty offices. Because it's conscious also that in order to build a successful strike movement, it will need the support of non-affiliated student unions. It starts organizing for a student strike coalition. The student federations, on their part, FEC and FERC, decide to adopt a wait-and-see approach to the strike. While ASSE activists are busy mobilizing on students on campus across the province, FEC and FERC are content with just representing student interests at Liberal Party meetings and the Generation Summit orchestrated by the government. To add insult to injury, the day the general strike is launched in February 2005, they go on record saying it's not the time for student mobilizations, and that also they had no plans at all to join any form of student strike action. In fact, since the education minister has been replaced just a few weeks earlier, they want to give him a chance. Well, hopefully the student movement doesn't occur, and within 2 weeks, 70,000 students are on strike in Quebec, including some student unions which are affiliated with FEC and FERC. The two federations are eventually forced into stepping in to the student strike, otherwise risk having some serious representation issues. And that about-face turns out to be a mixed blessing, though. While the student strike keeps expanding and rallying more and more student unions, the issue of negotiations come up. After one meeting with the ASSE Strike Coalition Negotiations Committee, the Education Minister declares he won't pursue any further negotiations with that student group unless it renounces, quote, violence, unquote. Of course, what he wants this student movement to renounce, student union to renounce, is in fact occupation of offices, routed protests, and blockades. In other words, the only tools at the disposal of students to disrupt business as usual. The issue will create lots of debate, especially in general assemblies and Congress meetings of the strike coalition. But thanks to the involvement and commitment of anarchists and radical activists inside these general assemblies and these different student meetings, the student coalition eventually decides to maintain its commitment to combative militancy. The student federations, on the other hand, decide to renounce violence immediately, which is somewhat ironic at the time, since they were the organizers of the most violent action of the strike so far, renting a huge battering ram and trying to break inside a Liberal Party meeting and creating some bloody confrontation. So the FEC and the FERC eventually begin close negotiations with the government. At the time, the strike coalition around ASSE is regrouping about a third of the unions who are on strike, and especially the longest striking student unions. So that move creates a lot of discontent, even among the rank and file of the student federations, who eventually launch a plea with their leadership to stop these closed negotiations and not negotiate any sort of agreement with the government unless delegates from the strike coalition are present. And so 5 weeks into that strike, the FEC and FERC announced an agreement to end the conflict. The agreement would see the cuts reversed, with only partially for the first few years, with full amount only being reinvested some years later. And by undermining the unity and the determination of the movement, that move succeeds in putting an end to the strike, with the most resilient student unions eventually ending their own strike action in the 7th week. In large part, however, because of the insistence of ASSE and the unions united in that strike coalition, that in the interest of maintaining democratic control over the movement, that any outcome of negotiations would have to be put to a vote in all general assemblies, and any outcome of agreement with the government would have to be put to a vote in general assemblies. So what happens is that most general assemblies will eventually reject the agreement, while at the same time, unfortunately, voting down continuing any form of strike action. There was a lot of anger, for sure, at FEC and FERC's leaderships during and after the strike. A lot of student movement from all quarters of the students felt they squandered the movement's historic mobilization. And not only that, but the struggle made also clear the political divide between those two poles of the student movement. FERC, it's a good thing, eventually paid a high price. Between 2005 and 2007, 5 large campus unions eventually leave the Federation, including the huge McGill undergraduate student union. As is often the case when chapters of struggle come to a close, the 2005 strike left a mixed feeling of victory and defeat. Victory, for one, because the strike ever happened at all, because it grew into the biggest strike in the student movement's entire history at the time, and because its power was enough to force some kind of concessions by the government, however small. But defeat also, because the strike coalition built around ASSE wasn't enough to prevent the FEC and FERC from appropriating the movement for themselves, for their own interests, and squandering the mobilization in exchange for unsatisfactory concessions. Even though the Liberals reluctantly agreed to reinvest some amount into financial aid, their next move can be more clear, which is a hike in university tuition fees. They don't wait 5 years until 2012 to do it, however. Right in 2007, they announced an immediate university tuition fee hike of 30% spread across 5 years, with another hike in 2012. Unfortunately, 2007 is somewhat less glorious chapter than 2005. ASSE takes a bold stand to launch a general strike with the main demand of free tuition, no less. No more than a handful of student unions eventually joined the strike action, however. Even some of the core unions of ASSE, which are really bastions of militancy, eventually come to reject the strike. The failure to block the strike in 2007 was a big blow, but as the student movement in Quebec has shown, it's got an ability to learn and evolve. I'm not saying that everyone just went home bitter, but disappointed, but optimistic. For sure, there was a lot of bitter debate and finger pointing. I mean, we are talking about the left here. Lots of different things were highlighted as having contributed to the failure. Bad internal dynamics at ASSE, not enough mobilization having been done on campuses, material not have been solid enough. But the most significant element, however, might have been the political miscalculation of having attempted to launch a strike on the basis of free tuition. In this way, this was a break, because we can't help but notice that the largest and most successful mobilizations in the student movement were giving a set of realistic and immediate goals. In '68, we had the demand for the democratization of higher education. In the '70s and '80s, you had the fights for improvements in student financial aid, and so forth. And it's through these kinds of objectives that the student movement is able to mobilize and grow. Part of the success of the student movement is an ability to relate to the concerns of regular students, of speaking to their day-to-day experience, while at the same time being able to articulate these demands to a wider political analysis that seeks to address the issues at their root. This leads me to the part where I want to talk about combative unionism. All through the history of the student movement in Quebec province, the syndicalist tendency has maintained that students need to organize into unions. It was true then, and I think it's still true today. For sure, students don't form a homogeneous class like workers do. And in any given campus, you'll have students from a really wealthy background with others who can just barely make ends meet. But despite this different socioeconomic background, students do form a community and they do share a common set of interests. And that regardless of their religious, political, or philosophical opinions. Chiefly, there is the issue of accessibility to education. With tuition constantly increasing, and students being pushed deeper and deeper into debt, being forced into precarious jobs to survive. The dream of higher education is fast becoming a nightmare in Canada and other countries. The gap between the myth of equality of chances and the reality of that lie is getting deeper. There's also matters of quality of education. In terms of student ratio, for example, access to appropriate study equipment, good libraries, study space. There's also concern about corporate influence over the content of courses and how programs are structured. And not to mention the issue of research being more and more oriented towards the goals of big businesses. While fundamental research in areas such as humanities, which, by the way, don't serve industry profits too much, are gradually being abandoned. These are all issues that can cement support for student unions. At the same time, I know a lot of students who are deeply involved on different campus groups like public interest research groups. They do a lot of hard work and they do address, I think, important issues. I have a lot of respect for what these activists do. But that kind of organizing isn't a substitute for student unions. Political groups alone can hope to build a movement of the same nature that we've seen in Quebec, because their aim simply isn't to build unity among students. Now, of course, most campuses these days already have some kind of student-led structure. So obviously it's not enough for students to organize into unions. There's different kinds of unions, and of course there's also different kinds of unionisms. The success of the Quebec strike lies in the ideas of a certain kind of unionism that's called combative unionism. And I assure you, it's not something that's dreamed up by a few academics or by industrial relations students. Combative unionism is actually an explicit set of practices promoted by the syndicalist tendency of the student movement in Quebec. In a nutshell, it calls for democratic, combative, and autonomous unions. That is what class is made of. First, combative unionism says unions should be run by their members, for their members. And the only way to do that is through direct democracy. It's a clear rejection of representative democracy, when disagreements and struggles are mediated by representatives who can act without grassroots support or without consultation of the student body. It's inevitably the interest of the authorities who are served and not the members. And the fundamental tool of that direct democracy is the General Assembly, or GA, or sometimes also called the General Membership Meetings. Only in these kinds of meetings can everyone voice their ideas on an equal footing, and where these voices can produce collective decisions which are then binding on the unions. And these meetings are important because they allow students to engage each other and develop capacities for debate and critical thinking. The power of the executive boards is explicitly limited to implementing the decisions stemming from these general assemblies and running the day-to-day operations of the union. Unions which practice combative unionism have also minimal bureaucracy. Paid employees aren't no substitute for anemic participation in student union committees and structures. And of course, instead of fixing the problem, it merely makes it permanent. For example, by the way, ASSE has always had one employee, and now I think it recruits about 65,000 students under the different the memberships of the different student unions. So compared to some other province-wide student unions, I think that's impressive. Dealings with administrations and higher authorities isn't based on the power of representation, but of delegations. Delegates have a clear mandate on which positions to defend and have no authority whatsoever to accept a compromise. Information, of course, is also key to a healthy democracy, so combative unions will rely on autonomous media to inform their members, whether it's through posters, leaflets, newspapers. Combative unions will use all the means at their disposal to make, firstly, make relevant news available to students, but also use all these as opportunities to engage directly with students and get them involved. In the same vein, of course, transparency on all levels of the organization, whether it's local, provincial, is made as real as possible. The second idea of combative unionism is, well, combativeness. These militant tactics stem from an understanding that, contrary to what the dominant ideology makes us think, the state is no sort of neutral institution where all sectors of society have equal standing. In reality, we know the state is a tool in the hands of private businesses and is submitted by the power of finance. And as a result, we can't ever hope to shame or convince the government into accepting student demands. That's why combative unionism, through mass mobilization and the power of numbers, seeks to build itself as a permanent counterpower that can force the satisfaction of student demands. The type of tactics it puts forth is a reflection of the unions themselves, by their members, for their members. In other words, that means direct action. We have to reject the notion that direct action is necessarily violent or destructive. At its core, direct action is all about the rank and file being at the forefront of all aspects and not representatives or politicians. In the spirit of combative unionism, direct actions also need to be mass actions. And the only way to do that is to take into account the general consciousness of the student body and the commitment of activists to the movement. So in that sense, general assemblies need to have a larger role in debating and orienting protest tactics. Combative unionism is also a refusal of confining methods of protest to the limits of legality. This flows from the idea about the nature of the state. If the state is a tool in the interest of a few powerful, then it's only logical that the laws of the state are designed to protect these same people. But it doesn't make illegality into a dogma either. Only that the different types of actions available to the movement are judged based on their own merit and their usefulness to the cause, and not whether or not they fit into the legal system. As a result of all this, combative unions will ally both common methods of protest, like marches, rallies, and strike action, with more vigorous stuff like occupations and blockades. The third core idea of combative unionism is autonomy. And in the interest of preventing alienation by its own methods of functioning by and for its members, combative unions need to promote and materialize their autonomy with regards to the state and also political groups. Autonomy with regards to the state structures, because students don't stand to gain anything by participating, especially when the nature of their demands contradicts the interests that control the state. This also translates into a rejection of participation in summits or government-organized consultations, and not least because these events are almost always used to legitimize future government decisions that often run counter to the demands of the student movement and their politics. Autonomy also with regards to political groups and political parties. Any political party which includes as part of its program a certain set of demands issued from the student movement, once in power, would inevitably be faced with the politics of compromise which are characteristic of the parliamentary system. And so as such, a political party's stance on certain student issues are always subject to be abandoned in the name of political realism. And for sure, historical examples confirm this. Those are the three core ideas of combative unionism, which have been part of the student movement since the very beginning. Hopefully through the decades, these ideas have been enriched, and one of the ways they have is by the incorporation of feminist thought and practices. It's often apparent, for example, when whether in radical groups or in mass movements, mass organizations such as unions, that the voices of women are not heard as much as the men's, or that the men's tend to get involved in ways that often get them on the spotlight, while women's involvement is often much more invisible. And so feminist women activists in the student movement in Quebec have worked relentlessly throughout the years, often under much criticism of their men comrades, to integrate not only feminist analysis of student issues, but also to institutionalize feminist practices in the student movement. For example, this can be viewed by the existence of women's committees in ASSE and other student unions, the common rule of alternation between women and men speakers in all types of meetings, and also the integration of a team of vibe checkers which keep tabs on hostilities and tensions during meetings, and also which can call out participants when they use stereotyped language. So that's all well and good. I've spoken about history, I've spoken about combative unionism. But of course, it's just not enough, I think, to just conjure up all these great ideas and hoping to create instant activism in the wake of this conference story. What the student movement outside of Quebec can learn most, I think, from is from the practices the student unions themselves have day to day. And so these can be adapted to local conditions and experiences in different student unions across English Canada. So I have outlined a few items I think might be important. First of all, of course, General Assemblies. These have been present throughout the existence of the student movement in Quebec. So these are not, to start off, these are not meetings which are convened once there's a strike vote to be, when there's strike action to be put to a vote. General Assemblies actually form the core of the student union there, and they're held as often as possible, whether it's during a campaign which includes mass mobilization and strikes and protests and demonstrations, but also day to day, even when there's no such campaigns being considered. It's not just strike mandates which are put to a vote in General Assemblies. Political positions of the unions are debated and adopted in these meetings. Whether the student movement in Quebec is very strongly in favor of free tuition and the right to education. That was created through the involvement of radical activists in these kinds of meetings. Anyone can bring motions and modify the motions in these General Assemblies. Everyone has to have equal footing. Of course, the rules of order are used so the debate can be somewhat structured, and that these debates can eventually produce collective decisions. So these kinds of meetings can be long, especially when, like on this picture, you have hundreds of students in a gymnasium. But it still works, and it's a price you have to pay for direct democracy, and I think it's important to maintain the importance of the nature of these General Assemblies, whether they last 2 hours or 5 or 6 hours, which as is sometimes the case. I wanted to show this picture because it shows us how how participants view the General Assembly. As you can see in the front, those two people are not from the student union of the General Assembly. These are activists from other campuses which come and facilitate and take the meeting notes. One thing you can immediately notice, I think, is that the executive is absent from being on top of in front of the meeting. In reality, the executive members, which are elected in the context of General Assemblies, are members just like everyone else. For sure, they can have a role in, for example, bringing motions to the floor, reporting on the student union's activities, inviting guests from other campuses or from other groups to speak to the General Assembly. But they have no special authority, or they have no special powers with regards to these meetings. The voting method has also been a subject of discussion outside even inside the Quebec student movement, but also outside. Votes are taken traditionally with a show of hands, whether it's regular procedures during the assembly or the actual strike vote. And this can sometimes spark discussions about the methods, the mechanisms of voting. But I think the core idea is that the General Assembly itself is in control of its voting mechanisms, and I think this does create very interesting debates about the nature of democracy, about the nature of what voting means, and the value of, for example, taking votes online. This is a picture of student congresses. The people you see around these tables are not entrusted with the power of representation of their student body. They are here with specific mandates from their general assemblies, and motions which are brought to the floor of these congresses need to have the support of general assemblies to pass. Otherwise, the motion has to be brought in each general assembly and adopted by a majority of student assemblies before they become the policies of the Quebec-wide student organization or strike coalition. I've spoken about the importance of information in alternative and autonomous media. These are a few covers from the Journal du Matin, which were produced weekly during the student strike in Quebec in the spring and summer of 2012. These papers were not only distributed massively in student protests or marches, but also used as tools to reach out to the general public. You might have heard of CUTV, Concordia University Television, which has been providing an insider's view of different protests and meetings in the student movement, effectively undermining the authority of traditional mass media with their biased filters and the right-wing political commentators, which often frame the debate. And so autonomous media such as CUTV are initiatives which are actively promoted and supported by the student movement at large. I wanted to speak a bit about mobilizations committees also. What are mobilization committees? Each campus or student union which wants to get its members involved, which wants to get activism on its campus, on its premises, starts by organizing mobilization committees. Those aren't extremely formal structures where you have a specific rules of order, a hierarchy of who speaks and who makes proposals. These are really ad hoc meetings with no elected capacities. And the basic idea is just to get students who want to get involved, activists who want to submit projects to their comrades, to network these people together and get them organized and get them to organize outreach, and which also can be used, for example, to mobilize students to get them to their general assemblies or to get them to the different actions which are organized in the context of different campaigns, for example. Ideally, the mandates for these for these mobilizations committee, of these mobilization committees are discussed and debated in general assemblies themselves. So in a way, these mobilizations committees always need to be connected to the larger student bodies through these general assemblies. They're also important in the context of a strike campaign, for example, to get students involved in building up momentum and building up mobilizations through organizing petitions, organizing marches on campus, organizing postering, and things like that. Things that can all build momentum towards a strike action. Mobilization committees are also play an important role also in the context when executives or employees which control a student union are hostile to mass mobilization. And since these committees are at their roots autonomous committees, they can be used. So, for example, in just an example, in Concordia University, the strike was organized per department, and some departmental student unions officials were actively opposing the strike and not wanting to have anything to do with it. And so these students grouped inside mobilization committees used the student union's bylaws to force the union to convene a general membership meeting and submit the strike motion in that meeting. That was all done because students started by taking their first step and organizing a single mobilization committee meeting. That's the first reason why you've heard about the Quebec student strike. When a strike mandate is adopted by student unions, students, which are whether for or against the unions, know that if the strike mandate is adopted, then classes will be effectively cancelled. And that the student union will take all means necessary to make sure that classes don't happen. And so picket lines are formed as soon as the union enters a strike action. So what you see is students surrounding the CEGEP building in Montreal. That specific picture is taken on a morning when the administration threatened to bring in police to break up the picket lines, and so you had mobilization across different campuses to converge and reinforce the picket lines of that specific institution. And the police attempt, which you can see a snapshot of, was ultimately unsuccessful in breaking the picket line. But of course, all university, all education institutions aren't the same. And in the case of university campuses, which can span across vast buildings, sometimes downtown connected with underground tunnels, it's not feasible to just prevent people from getting into the buildings. So how it's organized in universities in Quebec, how the strike is enforced is simply that students every morning, unless of course classes are cancelled by the administrations, which can happen when the strike, when the strike action is successful in the longer term. So how they organize is they meet each morning, divide themselves up, make small groups, and visit every single class, which falls under the department which has voted for the strike. And they either form a picket line in front of the door to prevent anyone from coming in. Sometimes they just take the teacher aside, prevent the teacher from coming in. Without any teacher, there's no class. Or simply, often, which is more often the case, as the class starts, the actors simply enter the class at the same time as other students and the teacher, and simply don't leave until the class is cancelled. So obviously the presence is an opportunity to engage with the students, inform them of the next General Assembly, talk about the issues and why the students are taking strike action, and trying to get the understanding of the necessity that the strike is respected in all So of course this can sometimes become a bit difficult for students who when this goes on for weeks on end, as was the case in the during the strike this spring. Students sometimes organize, they exchange campuses, so they're not always confronted to the same students and this can all sometimes help bring down tensions and some different groups of activists which give themselves the goal to cancel classes sometimes have different strategies, and creative strategies are also always interesting and are a great help to help the classes be cancelled. Seeing that the strike was only getting stronger and was being really effective in different institutions and university departments in which were taking part, some students, wealthy students I would say, were able to get court injunctions so that the administrations would be forced to organize the classes and have not only the authority but have the obligation to bring in security or bring in police so that picket lines would be broken and activists would be shut aside so that classes would happen. In the case of labor struggles, when employers successfully obtain injunctions from courts, this is often a huge blow to the struggle, and the strike action in these cases often comes to an abrupt end because the strike can't be effective in the context of an injunction which threatens huge fines to the activists who want to overcome it. But in the case of the student movement, the injunctions were unsuccessful. General assemblies voted to defy these injunctions, and across campuses across Quebec, those court orders were not able to be enforced by either police or security. This is the second reason you've heard about the Quebec student strike. Targets which were deemed legitimate not just by a handful of isolated activists, but literally by general assemblies, included financial district buildings, government-run institutions like the Montreal Casino. This is a blockade of the bridge leading to the Montreal Casino, which is a great idea, I think, because denying the rich their playground sometimes gets them listening. Ruling party gatherings and business gatherings. This is a snapshot of activists rushing to enter the conference of Salon Pendant, which you might have heard of, where a riot happened after this action was repressed. This is the inside before police were successful in pushing out demonstrators. So you can see they're not always entirely successful because, for example, in that case from the photo on the right, you see that riot police were operating surrounding the actual business meeting because that specific Congress building is there's lots of accesses from everywhere, so there was lots of ways to get into the meeting. So riot police had no choice to simply surround the business leaders and the Liberal Party officials, which were gathered to discuss the mining, forestry, exploitation of northern Quebec, as well as the exploitation of unceded indigenous lands. These kinds of actions didn't occur just in Montreal. Activists from campuses which were outside large urban centers also were inspired to carry out these kinds of actions. So roads, bridges, all kinds of smaller state-run buildings were targets. In Ministry of Revenue buildings, any kind of provincial building. This photo actually is a photo of the moment that the barricades surrounding the Parti Libéral, the General Parti Libéral Congress. This is the moment the barriers surrounding that Congress were smashed. And what I think is interesting about this particular picture is that really it's the actual moment the barriers were shot down, and you can see it's not just the actions of a few isolated activists who decided that was the thing to do, but it was actually planned. It was set up in advance, and that the result of that, of this organizing, this mass organization, is that when these activists threw the barriers away, the people didn't just stand there. They actually converged around the building and surrounded part of the building. So in a sense, this illustrates how radical direct action can be put in the service of mass mobilizations and not have them be in competition or in confrontation. For sure, this requires lots of debate and lots of organizing beforehand, before getting to that kind of moment. But the results make it much more interesting, I think. This is another target. Of course, the idea of disrupting, it also targets disrupting the economy. So these are actually snapshots of two different moments that the port of accesses to the port of Montreal were blocked. And so the idea was to prevent as many trucks as possible carrying merchandise from entering or exiting the different entry points of the port of Montreal. I wanted to show, you might not have a easy time reading, I'll read it for you. Sometimes it's difficult to, when you organize and when you participate in these kinds of actions, it's difficult to evaluate the real effect they have. But I think from these two articles, those are just examples that I think can convince people that they do have an effect and they do serve the movement's interest. The first one, student strike, Montreal presses Quebec to intervene. The game of cat and mouse in which students in Montreal forces are engaged in is starting to irritate the city of Montreal, even though that Montreal, that Montreal public security official Claude Vidal is pressing Quebec to reach an agreement with students. And the second one in Montreal Gazette, marches killing downtown economy. Student protests down their 6th week are having a detrimental effect on the city's economy, say merchants, truckers, and business people and city leaders. Hard figures are difficult to pin down, but the tactics of blocked bridges or stores and restaurants left empty because people are avoiding downtown are tangible. It's having a huge impact, says Matt Kenzer, president of Quebec Truckers Association. And another idea, lastly, I wanted to talk about, and which I could have easily included in the core ideas and principles of combative unionism, is solidarity. This idea about the necessity of the student movement to build bridges with other groups in society, other groups, other social groups which are struggling against the same types of neoliberal and austerity-inspired policies, which inspires them to build bridges together. So this slogan, la grève étudiante et la lutte populaire, means in English, it's a student strike, but a people's struggle. This is a photo from the action against the Salon Plan Nord, and this is a contingent of indigenous rights activists, which were holding a banner inside along the student protests. This one is from a labor movement demonstration in a city really far from Montreal, about I think 7 hours north of Montreal. These are aluminum factory workers marching against a very lengthy lockout of from their plant, and students who were on strike during that time we're keen enough to respond to calls for solidarity and busing student support from different cities across Quebec. So this brings my talk to a close. I hope you all stick around so we can have Q&A, discussion, and talk about what we do in Ontario.
I'm just going to be keeping the